Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Spiritual Perspectives. The section in Spiritual Perspective we are dealing in this program is the history of Islamic philosophy. We have reached to the point where we were mentioning that Islamic philosophy is purely based upon the Quran and Hadith. Islamic philosophy is not Islamic philosophy because Muslim philosophers have approached philosophy and have written or have contributed to Greek philosophy, and that's why it has become Islamic philosophy. But the Islamic philosophy is Islamic philosophy because its principles are purely based upon the Quran and Sunnah. Furthermore, we are also aware that philosophers from Kindi to Khomeini, they were all philosophers, whoever existed during this era from K to K, they were all philosophers, and they were practicing Sharia. They were Muslims, they were dedicated Muslims, and they practiced Deen and Islam. Like for example, Ibn Rushd, who was a philosopher, a great philosopher, Averroes, as we say in English. Ibn Rushd was the chief Qazi of Cordoba, and also we know that how other philosophers were, that they were participating as Qazi, as Mujtahideen, as Maraja even, where they were the source of jurisprudence, where they were the source of fiqh and fuqahat. Now, as we said, Quran is the ultimate source of knowledge for Muslim philosophers. Quran, because the Quran became the supreme source of knowledge, not only for religious texts such as Islamic law, but of the very nature of the existence and beyond existence of the very source of existence. Is understood through the Quran. Like if you may recall, we were talking about mathematics, we were talking about geography, we were talking about sciences and physics, and we said that the source, the beginning, the mabda, and also the end for the Muslim scientists to approach Islamic science is that. And they investigate that in that fashion. So same applies in the philosophy as well. The nature of wahi, the nature of revelation, has always been considered beyond comprehension. Nevertheless, it was discussed on the philosophical level. See, the philosophers, they already accept wahi as something that is supernatural. It is a supernatural metaphysical reality. See, all philosophers accept metaphysical realm. They all agree with immaterial reality. There is something that is spirit, there is something that is immaterial that exists. So, philosophically speaking, that is a point of unifying point where all philosophers agree on the metaphysical realm, on the metaphysical reality. And the different grades of this metaphysical reality. But here Muslim philosophers, when they say wahi, they say that okay, this is beyond comprehension. It is a phenomena, it is a reality that is beyond, that we are unable to understand, and it is infallible truth. It is nothing but the truth that descends, that comes from God. But at the same time, it is discussed on the philosophical level to establish its authenticity. The authenticity of it is established upon philosophical arguments. It will be critically examined and investigated and unanimously accepted that it becomes the source of ultimate knowledge. So it will be critically examined, it will be investigated, and unanimously accepted by all philosophers that it is the ultimate source of knowledge. For example, one might find Zakaria Razi, who died in 925 current era, negating the necessity of revelation in order to gain ultimate knowledge, but he could not even deny the existence of revelation. See, he did not deny the existence of revelation. So he took the revelation as nothing but the truth, a reality, a divine truth. He might negate that we find today, for example, some of the modern secular Muslim philosophers that might want to, that those who are influenced by secular philosophers might negate, but it is literally impossible by any philosopher to really deny the Quran, the revelation as the truth. Then there's a clear shift now when we look at when we approach the place of Quran and Hadith within the Islamic philosophy. We find that there's a clear shift of the understanding of aql, of intellect, among the Islamic philosophers and Greek or Aristotelian understanding. It is quite important here. Aql, intellect, how it is approached by philosophers, how Aristotle approached aql, how Spinoza approached aql, how Descartes approaches aql, how Kant approaches aql, how Ibn Sina approaches aql, how Farabi approaches aql, how Tabatabai approaches aql. There's a very different way of approaching aql. You see, Aristotelian understanding is the greatest proof now in regards to the approach of aql. Let's point out to the theoretical intellect, which they call it the aql nazari of the Islamic philosopher, is no longer that of Aristotle, the same way for the Aristotelian or the Greek philosophy, the aql nazari. Although his very terminology is translated into Arabic, the aql nazari, which is the epistemological tool of all philosophers or all philosophical activity, is Islamicized by in a subtle way. The clarity is understood when Mullah Sadra discusses this in the commentary of Usul-e-Kafi, where we find that the very first thing God created is the aql. There's a hadith in Usul-e-Kafi where it talks about aql, and that God created the aql first. So Mullah Sadra gives a commentary of this, and where he defines the differences between the Greek approach to intellect and the Islamic approach to intellect. Greek understanding of intellect is rational or rationale, logic, reason, deduction, but within Islamic universe it is a divine nature. Aql is of divine nature. It is related to the ruh. وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. Allah says that God breathed into Adam his spirit. So aql is of that substance which is sublime, which is pure, which is immaculate, which is faultless, which is infallible. Now, this is the way how Muslim philosophers approaches aql as. It is beyond. However, the Greek, they tend to approach in a different way, where you have deduction, where you have logic, rationale, so on and so forth. So here is a very fine and minute difference that we find. Now, if we move further in regards to the discussion of the place of Quran and Hadith, we said it's well known. So therefore, for those who want to follow, this is a key sort of difference that they could look up into Greek philosophy and Islamic philosophy, how aql and what is the place of aql in Islamic philosophy, what is the place of aql in Islam, and what is the place of aql in philosophy. Now then they will be able to, so I'm just providing you with a source of research. Now further, to add on to our discussion, it's well known among all Muslims, particularly to the students of Islamic tradition, that there is zahir, outward, that there is batin, that is inward, aspects of the Quran and Hadith. For them, it is very clear. They all accept that. Hence, philosophy is considered by Islamic philosopher to the inward aspect. Philosophy is something batin, aspect of this given reality. However, we do find many those who designate the life of the outward have heavily criticized philosophers. Those who take the approach of criticizing philosophers, they tend to be those who are taking just the apparent meaning of the Quran, the outward aspect of the law, and they tend to criticize the inward, or they tend to criticize that one must not engage in the hidden meaning of the Quran. Now, many of the jurists, many of the mujtahideen, theologians, they might criticize philosophers and philosophy by saying that. But I would ask a question that the akhbaris, which will deal in a program, the akhbarism and the usulis, the akhbaris, they also criticize the usulis. Those who are usulis, they also criticize the usulis by saying that you have no right to really understand or to deduct the Quran, what it is really trying to say. It is only the Imams or the Prophet, they have the knowledge of the batin of the Quran. The Quran might be saying something outwardly, but you cannot approach the Quran and you cannot understand the Quran. For example, how the usulis, they tend to come up with the principle of tacit meaning. The mafahim, the discussions of mafahim based upon the Quran. In ja'akum fasiq, when a fasiq comes to you, when a corrupt person comes to you and brings the news and gives to you, investigate. That is the verse of the Quran in Surah Hujurat. So therefore, you would say that khabar wahid, a news that comes from one person, and that person is a good person, then we will accept that khabar or that news, because the Quran is saying that when a bad person brings the news, you got to investigate. But which means that there is a tacit meaning in this verse, which means that when a good person brings the news to you, you do not investigate. So therefore, khabar wahid, a news that comes from a one person, is the authentic source of the law. The akhbari says this is wrong. You have no right to have this understanding, the mafahim, because you are not asked by the masumin. You are not even close to understand the batin, the inward meaning of the Quran. The akhbari says the jurist, the usulis. Now there are some usulis, there are some jurists who tend to criticize falsafa, who tend to criticize philosophers and Islamic philosophy, and they kind of shun this approach, and they say that one should not approach philosophy. One must not read philosophy, one must not indulge in philosophy, because you cannot understand the inward meaning. They only stick to the outward meaning. So I'll have the same argument for these jurists as well, that what the akhbaris have said, but you are accepting there, but you do not want to accept in the field of philosophy. Yes, indeed, we are not saying that we have the complete knowledge of the batin. However, we can approach and we have certain understanding by the help of the masumin. Now, when we look at the traces of philosophy and hadith, we may find, for example, the hadith of our sixth Imam, Imam Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam. He mentions that, may Allah have mercy upon Plato. May Allah have mercy upon Plato and Aristotle. They were men of God and invited people towards Tawheed with hikmat. They invited people towards Tawheed. Plato and Aristotle were the great philosophers, as you are aware. So they are seen in the traditions of Masumin alayhi salam. Enoch in the West, considered in the Quran as Idris. He is the Prophet Idris. In the West, Enoch. To the chain of prophecy is regarded as the origin of philosophy, while he is also bestowed with the title of Abul Hukama, the father of philosophers. Philo, Greek philosopher. Philo and certain later Greek philosophers were held in high esteem among the Muslim traditions. Philo is also regarded and held in high esteem. Enoch obviously is a West considered figure as the father of philosophers. He is Prophet Idris. Al-Hakim is a name of God. Hakim is the name of God, and also one of the names in the Quran. More specifically, many Islamic philosophers considered Luqman as a philosopher who was provided with the insight to reality, as the Quran says that we gave Luqman hikmat, and hikmat is considered as a khair kasir, abundance good. We gave him abundant good. Surah Baqarah, verse number 269. And also he will teach him book and wisdom, hikmat and wisdom. The Prophet وَيُزَكِّي وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. Hikmat, once again, as being used by Muslim philosophers as falsafa, as philosophy. We tend to find these verses in the Quran. The Western academia has ignored and neglected commentaries of Islamic philosophers on the Quran and Hadith. The reason, because Islamic philosophy to them was a simple extension of Greek philosophy. So they thought that Islamic philosophy, Islamic work, Islamic philosophers, when they are writing something, they are becoming the mouthpiece of Greek philosophy. They are just transferring, translating, or adding onto those concepts, those Greek concepts. However, they have approached Islamic philosophy in a very naive, in a very shallow way. So the commentaries of Mullah Sadra on the Quran is fascinating. The commentary of Ibn Turki, Sohrawardi, Ibn Arabi, and many other great philosophers that we find, and the most recent one is the commentary of the philosopher Allama Tabatabai. Now, what are the major themes discussed within Islamic philosophy? Certain Quranic themes have dominated Islamic philosophy. For example, Tawheed, amazing approach of Tawheed by Mullah Sadra, by Pythagoras, by Mullah Sadra, by Ibn Sina, by many of the. So it's one of the major theme that is discussed. Pythagoras was known as a Muwahid. Plato, Muwahid, was known as a Muwahid. So therefore that's number one. The other is ontology. The study of wujud is also overwhelmingly discussed in Islamic philosophy. For example, Ibn Sina was considered to discuss this extensively and is known as a philosopher of being. Philosopher of being. One must know that he is not thinking the Aristotelian thesis in Arabic or Persian, but it is due to the presence of the Quran, Quranic doctrine of the one in relation to the act of existence. Kun fayakun, how the existence created, what is the existence. So his approach is not an Aristotelian approach, but his approach is a kun fayakun approach. Why? How? This happened. The creating God, Khaliq, God as a creator, creatio ex nihilo, as the Greeks would say that. So therefore, creating God is extensively discussed. The creation is discussed, how it come into being. The Quranic themes of creation, sittat ayyams, these 6 days that God is saying that He's created the creation. The newness and eternity, which is known as huduth and qidam, is discussed. Tusi, Tajrish, in the books of philosophy, theology, Sadra, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, all of these philosophers, they tend to discuss this. Another issue concerns Islamic philosophy from Al-Kindi to Sadra and those who followed him is the God's knowledge, is the ilm of God. The Jewish and Christian counterparts developed philosophical theories totally absent from philosophical perspective of Greco-Alexandrian antiquity. So, they have developed it, the Jewish and Christian counterparts. For example, developed philosophical theories totally absent from philosophical perspective of Greco-Antiquity, which means that they did not approach that. They did not approach the issue of God's knowledge from that angle. But within the Islamic, we find that they have touched those bases, they have studied them, they have understood them, and they have added extensively to the knowledge of God. Like, for example, we would see St. Thomas Aquinas, who tend to adapt to some of the Aristotelian concepts in order to revive Christianity. But it was not the case within the Islamic philosophy or within Islam that in order to revive these philosophers, they approach Aristotle, but it was rather the opposite, that they criticized Aristotle, that they added on to the understanding of Aristotelian philosophy within the Islamic sort of universe. Cosmology is another of the subject that is extensively discussed. For example, Nur, what is the reality of Nur, commentaries on the verse of Nur, the essential of the Prophet. Mi'raj is discussed in falsafa, in philosophy. And finally, eschatology, the resurrection, how the day of judgment would be. Philosophically it is discussed, and as a matter of fact, you would not find any divine scriptures that have discussed Qiyamah in detail the way Quran have discussed. So Muslim philosophers approach eschatology, day of judgment, hereafter, resurrection, barzakh, the purgatory period, from Quranic philosophical perspective point of view. They analyze the Quranic verses in the light of aql, in the light of that philosophy. So these are some subjects that are discussed. Now, obviously, we tend to find within the Islamic framework two major schools, the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites. And inshallah, in our next session, we will continue from these two schools. And obviously, you have the Imamites, where do they fall in these schools? We'll discuss that further in our next program. Thank you very much for watching us, and we hope to see you next week again. Just to conclude briefly, we looked at the history of Islamic philosophy, and we answered to those who criticize, or those Orientalists who say that Islamic philosophy is nothing but the Greek philosophy, is an extension or is a translation or preservation of the Greek philosophy, and from there, the Western philosophy approach, and there's no value as such to Islamic philosophy. They're dead wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. They are fully unaware of that. We kind of pointed out to some of the views why they are wrong in this program. Hope to see you next week again. Goodbye.